I think I want to end 2024 by talking about a bit of a controversial subject, namely the legendary tier Italian battleship Lauria. But I don't really want to talk about the ship itself or how expensive it is to obtain. We've already covered that in a previous video. Instead, I want to talk about the ammo types on this ship, namely armor piercing and sap, because I've seen a lot of commentary around the community that says, or claims, I guess, the sap on the Lauria in particular is somehow underwhelming and shouldn't be used. These people seem to claim that most of the time you should actually be shooting the AP with the Lauria because the sap is just not that good. I don't know what these people are seeing or what they're playing, but I'm sorry to say completely disagree with them. I think it's just the opposite. If you're one of the few people that does own the Lauria and you want to play it effectively, then you would want to be using SAP the majority of the time. In fact, the only time you would use the AP is if you've got the flat broadside of a cruiser or battleship whose citadel belt armor you cannot penetrate with the SAP. That way, you shoot AP at them, you get citadels, and you do maximum damage. Otherwise, you want to be shooting sap most of the time. And, well, this first sequence of the battle, I think, is going to demonstrate to you the power of sap. But keep a couple of things in mind. Another thing people say about this ship, which I agree with, is that the main battery guns are not super consistent or super accurate. That's true. They aren't the best in the game, but they do have a quick reload, and I think that makes up for the lack of accuracy on certain individual salvos. Also, keep in mind we're running the fighter plane consumable in the third consumable slot. That's because we have Arthas as inspiration on this build, although we are going to use him sparingly. So most of the damage you see this sap do is going to be without the influence of Arthas, only in a couple of cases. I'll try and point those out. And finally, our commander build is Iachino. We've got all the accuracy skills selected on his skill tree, but the inspirations are, of course, Arthas and Kondo. No inspirations for accuracy, and yet our results are fine in terms of accuracy. Just ask the Alaska there. We hit him for 4 shells, that's half of our total firepower, and it does 18,000 damage without Arthas. Notice, too, that we aimed at the upper part of the ship, not at the waterline near the citadel, but the upper belt armor and superstructure. We've also got 2 enemy Laurias coming in, one of which is turning. He's not at a very flat angle, but the sap doesn't care. It still penetrates with 6 shells and 1 shatter, and we're up to 43,000 damage from 18k. That's well over 20,000 damage we did to that Lauria right there with sap. And if I remember correctly, only one of these Laurias is going to be shooting sap at anybody in return. Otherwise, they're going to be shooting AP. Perhaps they've heard that the sap is just underwhelming. Well, once again, another salvo with more than 20k. Although Arthas was active for that one, but still, you saw the 2 salvos where he wasn't and how much damage they did, with full penetrations, no ricochets, maybe a shatter or 2, but no overpens. That's significant. We'll talk about that in a moment as this enemy Lauria escapes into the Thunderdome. We hit him with 1 shell, which does 6,700 damage, rather. Again, that's with Arthas being active, but Arthas has gone down to recharge again, and we've only got this one enemy Lauria in front of us. The Alaska's out there, I think, having escaped, and there's a Colbert. No, the Alaska's right there about to go around the corner and escape, and there's also a Colbert out there who's moving in to try to farm us. We switched to the AP momentarily, thinking we were going to get the flat broadside of that Lauria, but he turns in, tightens up the angle, and the AP shells bounce. I think in that same situation, had we used sap, we would have gotten 3 pens. But Lauria is well on his way back to port. We're going to drive by him here and miss the drive-by shot because we're a little bit of a potato. If we could get the sap into that stern, Lauria would probably go down, but Yamato behind us will probably just overmatch his bow and send him back to port. And that only leaves the final enemy Lauria, who's inside of the Thunderdome. He's more or less flat broadside to us. So we could shoot the AP, but we've already got the SAP chambered, and it's going to do just fine, provided we aim into the upper belt armor and superstructure. We get 7, 8K there, not bad results. Might have taken him out, actually, with the Citadel, so this would probably be a good time to switch to the AP, but again, he's well on his way back to port. I don't even think we need to sink him. Instead, we'll let our teammates do that, get a second fisting ribbon, and then take aim at the enemy Colbert over there, who is presenting more or less flat broadside to us. Colbert, like Minotaur in Brisbane, is one of the cruisers in this game that the Lauria can dev strike and Citadel with SAP. Salvo's out, it reaches the Colbert, and there's a double Citadel for a dev strike and our first kill of the game. We're up to 122,000 damage done now, and with 9 minutes left on the clock, the game is more or less over now. The blue team is going to win unless the red team does something incredible, which they're not going to do. So all that's left to do now is simply farm damage with the SAP against the remaining reds, and that's what we're going to do for the rest of the match to bring our total up to around 179k or something like that. Not the highest damage I've ever done in this ship. The highest thus far has been 230,000. I think I did that on stream, maybe not. I might have to put that game up at some point in the future, but mostly the opening sequence in this battle is what I wanted to show you, because I think it demonstrates how effective this SAP is. But if you're finding that it's somehow underwhelming, I've got a couple of things to consider. Number one, the SAP has a set penetration value. It will pen up to 114 millimeters of armor, which means it's going to penetrate the bows and sterns of pretty much every battleship and cruiser you encounter at this tier and the tier below. It's also going to penetrate the upper belt armor and the superstructure of most battleships and cruisers too. Where it's not going to pen is the Citadel armor that's right at the waterline on the broadside. Generally speaking, when you're firing SAP, you don't want to aim there. You want to aim up a little bit like we're doing against Yamato here, so that you can guarantee hits on the upper belt, the deck, and the superstructure. And there's, 5 hits for, I don't even know how much damage, 30k. That's with Arthas active once again, I think. Even if you don't have him, though, the damage is quite devastating. I think I did 30k to a Columbo once without Arthas. Anyway, you want to aim into the upper parts of the ship when they're broadside. And one of the benefits of SAP is that it doesn't start checking for ricochets until the target reaches very, very steep angles, something like 70 to 80 degrees or so. Whereas even with the AP with the most improved penetration angles, that'll start checking for ricochets maybe at 55 to 65 degrees. So with the SAP, the angle does not matter nearly as much as it does with the AP. Very rarely will you get ricochets. Instead, what you'll most likely get are either full pens if you hit an armor surface that the SAP can penetrate, or shatters if you don't. But when you get penetrations with the SAP, it is always full penetrations. You never get overpens, unlike with AP. The only real downside to this SAP is versus enemy destroyers, it will only do 10% of its maximum shell damage, just like an overpen. So you might miss HE to some degree versus enemy DDs, but then again, this SAP does 16,000 maximum damage, so every overpen against a DD is going to be 1,600. You land a couple of shells, and all of a sudden, you've done well over 4,000 damage. Not an insignificant amount versus enemy DDs. You just probably aren't going to be getting dev strikes with it, and maybe you'll have to rely on your team a little bit more. That's the real sort of downside to SAP if there is one, but otherwise, it's an ammo type that combines basically the best characteristics of AP and HE. The best characteristic of HE is the armor, angle, and the distance doesn't really matter. The shell has a set penetration value. SAP has almost the same thing. It still checks for ricochets, but it has a set penetration value. And unlike HE, which deals relatively low alpha damage compared to AP, the SAP has alpha damage that is reminiscent of AP. In this case, it's actually higher than the AP alpha damage. So we take the two best aspects of both shells and combine them into one. And the only real downside is that they don't do full damage against destroyers, and they are also incapable of lighting fires to do damage over time like HE would. But you don't really need that when you've got an Alpha Strike this potent. And so I think the SAP is the way to go with the Lauria in particular. I'm not talking about any of the other battleships, although I think there's only one, which is the Marco Polo, if I remember correctly, that shoot sap from their main battery, but the Lauria in particular, you want to be shooting sap most of the time. I think the people who are telling you otherwise, unfortunately, they just maybe have not gotten lucky. Maybe they don't know where to aim. I don't know exactly what the problem is. It seems like we're maybe looking at different realities here because the sap on this thing is frankly outrageous. It's extremely potent, and I think because of it, this is one of the strongest battleships at Legendary tier. There's no doubt about that anymore in my mind. I don't know that it's better than, say, Ohio, for example. I think Ohio may just be the best battleship in this entire game, tier for tier. But the Lauria is definitely up there, and the sap is something that makes it really, really good. You want to be shooting the sap most of the time, but you have to have, number one, good aim. You have to know where to aim. And I think I've given you a good rule of thumb for that. Upper belt armor superstructure. And also, you have to have a working knowledge of armor schemes. There is certain armor in this game that the SAP simply won't pen, like that of the GK. The upper belt armor there is 150 millimeters. You won't be penning that. And if you got that flat broadside, then maybe a good idea to switch to the AP, because that will pen 150 millimeters, especially at close ranges. Even at the furthest range, it probably still will. But that would be the only time, really, you would switch to the AP from the SAP, is when you've got those kind of broadsides where the SAP can't pen the armor, like on the GK, or where you know you can get a Citadel with the AP. We finished this battle with 3,000 XP, which I think just goes to show how efficient our damage dealing was. Remember, you're not rewarded on the total number of damage you do, but on the percentage of the enemy's HP you take. And all of those salvos that we got, except for maybe one or two, were very high percentage HP removing shots. So the sap on this thing is potent. If you own this ship, I highly suggest taking it out and shooting exclusively sap for a while till you can get the hang of it. You have to have the general knowledge of the armor schemes, and you have to know where to aim. But, well, you might say that the shells are not super accurate. That's true, but I'm not spec'd into accuracy for this game, and I did just fine. In fact, I'm never spec'd fully into accuracy with double inspiration slots, so I don't know what to tell you, those of you who are and still are unhappy with your salvos. Maybe try speccing into concealment like I do. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this video. I will see you next year. Goodbye for now.